Okay, welcome back. We're in chapter 7, the first 2 years, psychosocial development. So, in this chapter, we're going to be talking about basically social development, personality, emotional things. All of that will always be under the psychosocial header. So, let's start off with the development of play skills. That's a social activity. Right? Babies' jobs, children's jobs, are to play, to learn about how the world works by playing with it. So there are different kinds of play. There are a couple of kids displaying functional play, where they're filling up containers and they're moving things around to find out how exactly things function. Here we have constructive play, where a child's playing with, that's even bigger than a Duplo, right? He's putting things together to see what can form on his own. Here we have pretend play, where the child is pretending like the mouse is a phone, right? Pretend play gets more elaborate as children age. All of these things get more elaborate as children age. So these are 0 to 2-year-olds in all of these pictures where they're trying to play with the world. And then I thought it was really important to emphasize rough and tumble play. When babies are pretty young, a lot of times, especially the moms and the grandmas, are thinking, don't play so rough, you're going to hurt the baby. But dads in particular are very inclined to play in a rough and tumble way with their infants and then their into the childhood years. And it turns out that just like the other types of play, rough and tumble play is really important for babies and children to learn self-regulation and how far you can go and that this is just pretend and don't get mad and things like that. So all of these types of play have really important learning mechanisms involved in them so that children, babies in this case, can learn how the world works. And that's the whole job of the baby, is to figure out how the world works. I've linked in the classroom a video on rough and tumble play that you can check out to see what it is and how beneficial it is. Now, emotions. We have a baby, and presumably it's mommy, and they're both making the same face. And they're looking each other in the eye, and they're reacting to each other. That's the thing about emotions between babies and their caregivers in particular, is that babies react to the caregivers, and the caregivers react to the babies, and it's mutual. A lot of times people, when we're young and we haven't had our own children, we oftentimes think of parents as different than ourselves. Like, parents are adults and have always been adults, and they always know what they're doing. Adults and babies are only different from each other by age and some knowledge, right? And so parents are reacting to their babies and interacting with their babies based on what they're picking up from their babies. And so it isn't like when we were being raised by our parents, were just passive absorbers of what our parents were doing. Our parents were reacting to us, and we were reacting to our parents, and all of this was going back and forth. It's a mutual regulation model. It goes both directions. I brought up social referencing in a previous lecture because it's a really important thing for babies. When they are in an unsure situation, they don't really know whether this new person is friend or foe. They don't really know if it's okay that loud noise just happened. They don't really know if they're really hurt after they fell down. They're kind of stunned for a second. Am I hurt? They oftentimes will look to their caregiver for information. How should I be reacting? And based on their caregiver's response, they'll gauge their own response. Now, it's not always 100%. There are times when the caregiver is completely excited to see this newcomer and the baby is not. And no amount of encouragement from their caregiver can cause the baby to change their mind. Well, those are babies who aren't social referencing. Those are babies who do not think this is an ambiguous situation. These are babies who have decided this person is new. I don't know this person. I want nothing to do with this person. That's different. I'm talking about when it's ambiguous to the baby, and the baby's not sure how to react. Then they look to their caregiver to figure out how the caregivers respond. Some gender differences in emotions. Girl babies, when they cry, are more likely to be labeled as they're crying because they're scared. oh, she heard something loud and it startled her and she's crying. So that kind of early labeling causes adults to interpret messages coming from their girl babies from a different perspective. Uh, Now, I have to say, I'm going to give you guys personal examples as things go on. I've got two grown kids now, but when they were babies, um, I had a PhD in psychology, and I was going to raise my daughter. She was born back in 1993, and I was going to raise her, letting her lead the way. Right? She's an individual. She'll show me what kind of person she is, and I'll respond to that. And my son, same thing. He's going to be his own little person. He can decide for himself. When my daughter was little, I noticed in particular that the grandparents in the family were much more likely to label her reactions as fearful. And I know for sure my son, when something scary would happen, and I would say, "Oh, I know that's scary, but you're okay," my dad would say, "Oh, he's not scared. He's just mad that this or that happened." He'd literally relabel what I had tried to say. Um, it's kind of interesting. You can do what you want as a parent, but there are messages coming from other people that can be just as important, and for some reason, sometimes more important than what parents are trying to put out. So girls being labeled as fearful and boys being labeled as angry, when they're having potentially the exact same reaction to the exact same stimulus, it's kind of an interesting difference in how people regard babies, because they are in fact babies and might be, everybody's reacting the same way independent of sex, but because we interpret others' behaviors through our own lens, we might be misinterpreting the reactions and labeling it in ways that suit our own interpretations. So yeah, it's quite tricky. Now, with social development, something that's really super important to us psychologists is how babies form attachments to their caregivers. So how do babies come to trust their caregivers and see them as a safe place to launch from for exploration and other confident behaviors? The strange situation experiment was developed to assess attachment styles. And this video that's linked in the classroom is a video about how the strange situation is conducted and like that. So it's a really good video to check out because it literally shows you a baby going through it. So here's the basic premise. There are different attachment types that might be observed through the strange situation. In the strange situation, you have a caregiver and an infant who's between 12 and 24 months of age. That's really an important age limit that you need to recognize. If while taking this class, you know a baby who's less than 12 months or older than 24 months, you think, well, maybe I'll just try it out on them. They're either too young or too old. You may get incorrect impressions. 12 to 24 months is the limit. And the situation is called strange because it's strange to the baby and the caregiver. It's not strange in like the world. It's just strange to them. They've never been there before. And so you take the mom in most studies, but now they've extended it out to dads and grandmas and other kinds of caregivers, and take them and the infant and put them into a room. It's probably a laboratory in a psychology department, which means it's just a big room at a university, and it's got a big pile of toys on the floor that are age appropriate for the infant. Mom is very specifically told, I'm going to say mom just because that's what most of the research has been on. So mom's told to sit in this chair. Usually she's given something to do, read these magazines or fill out this paperwork. And then she's told, don't initiate contact with your baby, but if your baby, reaches out and initiates contact with you, then absolutely respond the way you normally do. Just don't you start it. And then the baby's shown some of the toys to try and get them to engage with the pile of toys in the middle of the room. And then the researchers leave, and then they observe through a two-way mirror to see how the baby plays or interacts while the caregiver is present. Then at some point, the caregiver will hear a knock on the door, and that's the indicator to get up and leave the room. And the baby's response is gauged during the time that the caregiver is absent. Usually the caregiver is out of the room for 45 seconds, maybe a minute and a half at the most, to see how the baby's going to respond. And the caregiver can watch through the two-way mirror to be reassured that the baby's okay. And then the caregiver goes back in the room and usually holds their arms out to the infant, tries to hold them and, initiate with the baby. We want to see how the baby responds. So at all points, all three of these points, when the caregiver is present, when the caregiver is absent, and when the caregiver returns, we're interested in how the baby's going to react. Okay, so at least half of the babies who have been tested have fallen into the secure attachment type, which means that while the caregiver is present, the baby is willing to explore the environment, play with the toys, things like that. But the important thing is, while being exploratory, the baby touches bases with the caregiver quite frequently. It might be that they just look at the caregiver and show the caregiver the toy that they're holding and go, because remember, these are 12 to 24-month-olds, so they probably can't say anything very, relevant, but they'll be like, and, mom goes, oh yeah, that's really neat, isn't it? And then the baby goes back to playing. Or the baby might crawl over or toddle over with the toy and show it to the caregiver. And so there's like this touching base and then go back out and explore kind of aspect to it. When the caregiver gets up and leaves, the baby is likely to protest. And by that I mean the baby cries, and it's sad. The baby's like, well, you forgot me. They're not mad. They're not really particularly distressed. They just are like, I can't believe you left me here. And then when the mom comes back in, when the caregiver comes back in, the baby calms very quickly and gets back engaged with the toys and is ready to explore the world again because their safe base is back. So it's really clear that the thing that was wrong with the baby during the absence was literally the caregiver was gone. And so the caregiver's returns everything back to normal. So yay, I'm done. Then there are the remaining babies who fall into one of two insecure types. The first insecure type is called the avoidant type. And these babies explore the environment without any concern for support or presence of their caregiver. They're too confident. And, when you're a 12 to 24-month-old, it's not advantageous to be exploring without any support from your caregiver. So it's actually an area of concern to see a baby who's too exploratory. But more importantly, when the caregiver leaves the room, the avoidant baby is literally doesn't care, barely looks up that the caregiver has left. And then when the caregiver comes back, the avoidant baby, same thing, barely looks up, doesn't really care, is not seeing their caregiver as a secure base. The avoidant baby seems to feel like they're on their own and they're just going about their business independently. The other type of insecure baby is the ambivalent baby or the resistant baby. These babies are very clingy when their caregiver is present. They tend to sit right next to their caregiver. They want to try and crawl up into their caregiver's lap. They don't want to explore the toys. They don't want to check out anything about this new environment. They just want to stick as close as they can to their caregiver. Sometimes it's the caregiver who's the clingy one in these dyads. Sometimes the caregiver is the one who I told you earlier that the mom has been told to sit and read magazines or fill out this paperwork. Sometimes it's that the caregiver who stops doing what he or she's been told to do and instead initiates contact with the baby, which is the second stage of instructions that the caregiver had been told. Sit here and fill out this stuff that we told you to, and respond to the baby if the baby initiates, don't you initiate. Well, ambivalent caregivers oftentimes not only initiate contact with the baby, but will actually get down on the floor, be playing with what the baby's playing with, showing them how it works, not letting them be exploratory, instead inserting themselves. When the caregiver leaves, the ambivalent baby throws a tantrum. They are just beside themselves that their caregiver could leave them, and they're angry about it. When the caregiver comes back and tries to pick the baby up to calm them down, the baby is angry and wants to punish the caregiver. So we'll slap the caregiver's cheek, or we'll pull her hair, or we'll arch the baby. The baby will arch their back so that the caregiver has to put them down. The caregiver might try to get them re-engaged with the toys, and the baby just wants nothing to do with it. So the ambivalent baby is angry that the caregiver left, and then the caregiver's return is not the solution. There's more to it. There's something wrong. So we have these three main attachment types. Most babies are secure, and then the remaining babies are roughly divided equally between avoidant and ambivalent. So I think you guys could probably tell that the secure attachment type is probably the type that, most parents would want to have with their toddlers. And so parents oftentimes want to know, well, what can I do to help ensure that I would have a secure attachment with my baby? Well, it's kind of hard to say what the caregiver needs to do, because there are so many variations in caregiver behavior among those caregivers who have securely attached babies. So it's really difficult to say exactly what the caregiver does. But there's one big consistency, which is being responsive to the needs of the baby. So during the first, for sure, 6 months of the baby's life, and some caregivers report as much as the first year of the baby's life, when the baby was hungry, they fed them. When the baby cried, they consoled them. They tried to meet the baby's needs and really, build that contingency awareness that I talked about before. There's some debate among developmentalists and pediatricians and things about how long is ideal for the caregiver to be that responsive. Some say the first 6 months, and then it's time to start teaching the baby. Well, sometimes you're going to have to wait. Sometimes it's time to sleep, not time to cry for mommy and daddy. Other people say, well, give them the whole first year. It's hard to really say, but all we can know for sure is that a responsive caregiver seems to be associated with a securely attached baby. Now, the reason why it might be so difficult to figure out what the parents should do is that there is, like we talked about already, the emotional, mutual regulation model. It's the same thing with attachment formation, because some babies want certain things from their parents, and other babies want other things from their parents. And so it might be even more important what the baby's doing that determines whether there's a secure attachment or not. Securely attached babies tend to be healthy babies who don't do a lot of crying and don't have really life-threatening problems. There are some theories that maybe the babies who are sicker or have colic or something like that might be hard to care for and really make parents question their competence, and then it makes it harder for them to be, fully responsive. If you have a baby who cries and no matter what you do, you can't get them to stop crying because they've got colic, it can cause learned helplessness in the parent. And so they ultimately feel like inadequate parents. And so they start to lose their competence. So securely attached babies might be babies who are easier to care for one thing. Another thing is that some babies have easier needs than other babies. And so the ones with the easier needs, it might be easier to form a secure attachment with them because their needs get met more regularly than babies who have harder needs. So it's kind of hard to pin down. But what effect does the attachment style have? Well, there are some long-term effects. We look at babies into childhood. They find that babies who are securely attached as infants are more likely to be exploratory as children, to try new things, to make friends easily, to know how to take turns. As they move on into adolescence, they tend to have more durable friendships. And when we get into adulthood, we see more durable romantic relationships. So it seems to have a benefit for all kinds of relationships throughout lifetime to have a secure attachment when you're an infant. So caregivers can do the absolute best that they can, and then that's about all we can really hope for, because I think there's a part that comes out of the baby that makes it a little bit, um, like out of the parent's control, whether they develop a secure attachment or not. How about stranger anxiety, or what our textbook calls stranger wariness? This is that very common occurrence where babies between about 9 and 13 months of age will be at the peak of their stranger wariness, where they just do not want strangers to get near them, to touch them, to look at them. They just do not like strangers. And, evolutionary psychology suggests that that's because babies who are 9 to 13 months old are just now learning how to crawl and walk. And if they weren't scared of strangers, they might wander off with people who are dangerous and could harm them. And so it's maybe to our species' benefit that we have this stranger wariness. Here in the US, we don't really like seeing our children display fear. So we try and get them to get over it. We're almost a little bit embarrassed if they're scared of strangers. But it's a very normal developmental milestone that babies all around the world go through between 9 and 13 months, be scared of new people. To reduce stranger anxiety, a stranger, like let's say the uncle who hasn't seen the baby in 3 months, and now the baby's in stranger anxiety, the uncle could take steps to reduce that anxiety by, for example, speaking in a quieter voice, by sitting down next to the parents and ignoring the baby. Like Cesar Millan says about whispering for dogs, it's the same thing for babies. No touch, no talk, no eye contact. Just ignore the baby and let the baby come to you. And try not to take it personally. Separation anxiety is sort of the flip side of this, which is where the baby is anxious about their caregiver never coming back. And it's very closely tied to object permanence, where you have the awareness. You don't yet have the awareness that your parents are objects that will continue to exist if they're out of your sight. And so it makes you very anxious as a baby to think that they could disappear and they literally could never come back. Like out of sight, they're gone. And so babies can become quite clingy and really scared of their parents leaving. And usually it starts to emerge around 8 or 9 months of age. But once kids have object permanence, it starts to wane. So once they realize that their parents continue to exist even when they can't see them, then they become less anxious about separations and stuff. Now, I've heard some people say, well, I wonder if babies would have less separation anxiety if they had to separate from their parents every single day very reliably, as in like being dropped off for childcare of some sort every single day while mom and dad go to work. And it turns out that it actually brings separation anxiety on a little earlier, but it lasts exactly the same amount of time. So it'll start earlier and end earlier, but takes the same amount of time to get through. It's just a developmental stage where babies go through this fear that they're not going to be able to reconstruct their parents. And so it's terrifying to think, well, what if I can't do the magical thing like the A not B error and pull the right towel and get my parents to come back? So it's really scary. And so predictability is super important. And then also for parents to realize this too shall pass is an important thing. But the other thing is, out of sight, out of existence means that shortly after you leave, it's kind of like you never were there, and they'll forget for a little while until you come back. I don't know if that's reassuring for a young parent or not, right? Parent of a young baby to realize, oh, all I have to do is leave and they'll just forget about me anyway. That's kind of a horrifying thought, isn't it? They remember you when you come back, though. That's how we know they have memory. So they're anxious, but they ultimately grow out of it. So yay. All right. Well, that concludes our 0 to 2-year-old lecture. So next time I see you, we'll be talking about the preschool years.